Have you ever heard a story so shocking it makes you question everything? Today, we're diving into a jaw-dropping tale of assumptions, injustice, and an unbelievable twist you won't see coming. Imagine a routine emergency spiraling out of control because of one officer's prejudice, and the fallout that changes everything. Before we jump in, take a moment to subscribe to this channel for more gripping stories that challenge the way we think about the world. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Let's get into it. It was an ordinary Friday afternoon, but for paramedic Darren Mitchell, ordinary was never quiet. As the senior paramedic on duty, Darren was used to high-pressure situations, but today was different. The call had come in moments ago. A high-profile patient had collapsed at a public event. Time wasn't just ticking, it was racing. Every decision Darren made could mean the difference between life and death. The ambulance, sirens blaring, sped through the bustling downtown intersection. Traffic was heavy, and the streets were alive with the usual chaos of a busy city. Honking cars, distracted pedestrians, and impatient drivers. Darren barely noticed any of it. His focus was razor sharp, his mind running through the steps needed to keep the patient stable until they reached the hospital. But someone else noticed. The wrong someone. Officer Paul Radcliffe, stationed nearby for traffic control, was already in a foul mood. Known for his quick temper, and more quietly, for his problematic attitude toward certain groups of people, Radcliffe had already written 3 tickets that day and berated a driver who made the mistake of asking him for directions. When the ambulance approached the intersection, Radcliffe blew his whistle and gestured for it to stop. He believed it was his duty to control the flow of traffic, even for emergency vehicles. But Darren, knowing every second mattered, slowed briefly to assess the road and then continued through. Inside the ambulance, the patient's vitals were unstable, and the medical team was doing everything they could to keep him alive. Radcliffe saw the ambulance pass, and something inside him snapped. To him, it wasn't just an emergency vehicle, it was a blatant act of disrespect. They think they can just ignore me, he muttered under his breath. His hand clenched the whistle tightly as he watched the ambulance's taillights disappear down the road. Unbeknownst to Darren, Radcliffe jumped into his patrol car and activated his sirens. His frustration had boiled over into anger, and he decided to make an example of the ambulance crew. If they think they can disregard authority, they're in for a rude awakening, he muttered to himself as he accelerated through the streets. Inside the ambulance, Darren and his team remained oblivious to the escalating situation behind them. The patient, a middle-aged man in formal attire, was barely holding on. Darren's hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting an IV and calling out for vitals. "How's his heart rate?" he asked one of the paramedics, his tone calm but firm. "Still weak, but steady for now," the paramedic replied. Darren nodded, his mind already anticipating their arrival at the hospital. He had no time to think about anything else. Meanwhile, Radcliffe's anger grew with every passing second. He interpreted the ambulance's continued speed as defiance. His thoughts spiraled. Who do they think they are? Ignoring traffic laws, disregarding me. He didn't stop to consider the emergency they might be responding to. For Radcliffe, this was personal. When he finally caught up to the ambulance, it had just pulled into the hospital's emergency bay. Without hesitation, Radcliffe slammed his car into park and stormed out. Darren was stepping out of the driver's seat, ready to assist his team, when Radcliffe's booming voice stopped him in his tracks. "You think you're above the law?" Radcliffe shouted, his face flushed. Darren, momentarily confused, turned to see the officer marching toward him. "What's the problem?" Darren asked, keeping his voice steady. He didn't have time for this. There was a life in his hands. "You ran a red light and ignored my commands," Radcliffe barked. "You paramedics think you can do whatever you want. Well, not today." Darren tried to explain, gesturing toward the back of the ambulance. "Officer, we've got a critical patient inside. I need to get to him now." But Radcliffe wasn't listening. He stepped closer, invading Darren's personal space. "Don't give me excuses. You put people in danger out there." "Listen," Darren said, his patience wearing thin. "I'm not arguing with you, but every second counts. Let me do my job." Radcliffe's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it looked like he might back down. But then, in a flash of anger, he grabbed Darren by the arm as he tried to walk away. "You're not going anywhere," he snapped. Darren pulled his arm free, his voice firm. "Let me go. I have a patient who needs me." The tension between them was palpable. But before Darren could take another step, Radcliffe's frustration boiled over. He raised his fist and punched Darren in the face, sending him staggering backward. The crowd outside the hospital, made up of nurses, patients, and passersby, froze in shock. Gasps rippled through the air as Darren hit the ground, his hand instinctively going to his jaw. "What are you doing?" someone shouted. A nurse rushed to Darren's side, her voice trembling as she called for security. Radcliffe stood there, his chest heaving, still convinced he was in the right. "You're under arrest," he barked, reaching for his handcuffs. But before he could act, the back doors of the ambulance swung open, and that's when everything began to unravel. Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you speechless. And if this story has you hooked, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. There's more to this story than meets the eye, and you won't want to miss the twists that are still to come. The chaos outside the hospital reached a boiling point. Darren, still reeling from the punch, was struggling to his feet with the help of a nurse. Officer Radcliffe was pacing, his anger not yet spent, muttering about reckless paramedics and disrespecting the law. Onlookers had begun recording the scene with their phones, their murmurs growing louder as the tension mounted. Then, with a dramatic swing, the back doors of the ambulance burst open. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. Inside the vehicle, two paramedics were working furiously to stabilize the patient, who was lying unconscious on the stretcher. The sight of medical equipment beeping and the paramedics' frantic movements should have been enough to make anyone pause. But Radcliffe didn't flinch. Instead, he marched toward the open doors, barking, "Who's in there, and why is this so urgent?" The senior paramedic inside, Lisa, glared at him as she adjusted an oxygen mask over the patient's face. "Are you out of your mind? This man is critical," she snapped, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. But Radcliffe was too caught up in his misplaced sense of authority to care. "Critical, huh? Let's see who you're breaking all the rules for," he said, climbing into the ambulance to get a closer look. As Radcliffe leaned over the stretcher, the murmurs of the crowd turned into audible gasps. He froze. His face, previously twisted in anger, drained of color as recognition hit him like a freight train. The man on the stretcher wasn't just any patient. It was Mayor Charles Thompson, the city's first black mayor, a widely respected leader, and a tireless advocate for unity and progress in the community. The senior paramedic inside, Lisa, glared at him as she adjusted an oxygen mask over the patient's face. "Are you out of your mind? This man is critical," she snapped, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. But Radcliffe was too caught up in his misplaced sense of authority to care. "Critical, huh? Let's see who you're breaking all the rules for," he said, climbing into the ambulance to get a closer look. As Radcliffe leaned over the stretcher, the murmurs of the crowd turned into audible gasps. He froze. His face, previously twisted in anger, drained of color as recognition hit him like a freight train. The man on the stretcher wasn't just any patient. It was Mayor Charles Thompson, the city's first black mayor, a widely respected leader, and a tireless advocate for unity and progress in the community. Radcliffe stumbled back, his eyes darting between the unconscious mayor and the paramedics. For a moment, he was speechless. That's the mayor," he stammered. Lisa didn't hold back. "Yes, it's the mayor. And while you're out here playing power games, we're trying to save his life." The crowd, now fully aware of what was happening, erupted into a mix of outrage and disbelief. He punched a paramedic who was trying to save the mayor. Someone shouted. Another person yelled, "Get him out of here. He's a disgrace." Radcliffe's face turned beet red, but this time it wasn't from anger, it was from shame. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of his actions was sinking in fast. He had assaulted a paramedic, obstructed an emergency medical team, and, worst of all, jeopardized the life of a man who represented everything good about the city. Darren, still holding his sore jaw, stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Are you done now, officer? Because we have a life to save." The crowd cheered in support, their phones still recording every moment. Radcliffe looked around, realizing there was no way out of the mess he had created. Just then, the hospital's chief of staff rushed out, followed by several nurses and doctors. They had been alerted about the situation by onlookers and hospital security. The chief, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Evelyn Carter, glared at Radcliffe. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. Before Radcliffe could respond, Lisa stepped out of the ambulance and pointed at him. "This officer assaulted Darren while we were trying to get the mayor inside. He delayed us, and it could have cost the mayor his life." Dr. Carter's eyes narrowed as she turned to Radcliffe. "You assaulted a paramedic. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Radcliffe stammered. "I didn't know it was the mayor." Dr. Carter cut him off. "It doesn't matter who it was. They're paramedics. Their job is to save lives, and your job was to get out of their way. Instead, you interfered, attacked someone, and put a patient's life at risk. You've crossed every line imaginable." Radcliffe's authority was crumbling before his eyes. The crowd, emboldened by Dr. Carter's words, began chanting, "Shame, shame, shame." Several of them stepped forward to show the videos they had recorded, offering undeniable proof of what had happened. Security guards moved in, not to remove Darren or the paramedics, but to escort Radcliffe away from the scene. As Radcliffe was led off, his head hung low, Darren turned back to the patient. "Let's get him inside," he said, his voice steady and determined. The paramedics sprang into action, wheeling Mayor Thompson through the hospital doors as the crowd parted, offering words of support and gratitude. If this story has kept you hooked so far, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us bring stories like this to light. The aftermath of the incident spread like wildfire. Within hours, the story was all over social media, with videos of Officer Radcliffe punching Darren and delaying the ambulance shared thousands of times. Headlines screened phrases like, "Paramedic assaulted while saving mayor's life," and "Rogue cop's actions put mayor in danger." The city, already grappling with tensions over police misconduct, was in an uproar. At the hospital, Mayor Charles Thompson was stabilized and transferred to the intensive care unit. Doctors confirmed that Darren and his team's quick actions likely saved his life, but they also acknowledged that every second had been critical. The delay caused by Radcliffe's interference could have cost the mayor dearly. The gravity of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. Meanwhile, Darren was sitting in a quiet corner of the hospital, nursing his bruised jaw. Nurses and doctors came by to check on him, offering words of support and gratitude. Darren wasn't the type to seek attention, but the overwhelming response from the community touched him deeply. "I was just doing my job," he said humbly. "I just wish none of this had happened." Across town, Officer Radcliffe was facing the consequences of his actions. The police chief, a no-nonsense veteran named Gerald O'Connor, summoned him to an emergency meeting at headquarters. Radcliffe walked into the room, his usual bravado replaced with visible unease. Sitting at the table were the chief, the deputy mayor, and the city's legal counsel. The atmosphere was tense. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Chief O'Connor began, his voice sharp and controlled. "You assaulted a paramedic, obstructed an emergency medical response, and put the mayor's life at risk. Your actions were reckless, unprofessional, and unacceptable. Radcliffe tried to defend himself. I didn't know it was the mayor. That's irrelevant. The chief roared. It doesn't matter who the patient was. Your job was to assist, not escalate. Instead, you let your anger and prejudice cloud your judgment. The legal counsel chimed in. We've already received calls from multiple witnesses offering to testify, and the videos circulating online are damning. You'll be placed on immediate suspension pending an internal investigation, and you may face criminal charges. Radcliffe sat in stunned silence. For years, he had operated with a sense of impunity, but now it was clear that his actions had caught up with him. His career and his reputation were crumbling before his eyes. Back at the hospital, the community rallied around Darren. A press conference was hastily organized in the hospital lobby, where Mayor Thompson's family and hospital officials publicly praised the paramedics for their heroic efforts. The mayor's wife, a poised but visibly emotional woman, personally thanked Darren. Your quick thinking and bravery saved my husband's life, she said, her voice trembling. We can never thank you enough for what you've done. Darren, always modest, simply replied, I was just doing my job, Mom. The press conference turned into a call for accountability. Local activists demanded Radcliffe's immediate termination and a broader investigation into the police department's handling of misconduct complaints. Community leaders highlighted the incident as an example of the dangers of unchecked bias and authority. A few days later, Mayor Thompson, now well enough to make a public statement, addressed the city from his hospital room. His words were powerful and unifying. I owe my life to the incredible paramedics who refused to give up on me, even in the face of unnecessary obstacles. What happened to Darren Mitchell was unacceptable, and it reflects a deeper issue that we must confront as a community. We need accountability, justice, and above all, respect for one another, regardless of our roles or backgrounds. The mayor's speech resonated far beyond the city. News outlets across the country picked up the story, turning Darren into a symbol of resilience and dedication. Radcliffe, on the other hand, became the face of everything that needed to change within law enforcement. In the weeks that followed, Radcliffe's case moved forward. He was formally charged with assault and obstruction, and the police department announced a comprehensive review of its policies and training programs. Darren, though reluctant to take the spotlight, became a local hero. Community members organized a fundraiser to support him and his team, raising money for new medical equipment and training. But Darren's focus remained where it had always been, on his work. When asked how he felt about the incident, he said, I just hope this serves as a reminder of what really matters. It's not about power or pride. It's about helping people and saving lives. The incident involving Officer Radcliffe and Darren Mitchell quickly became a catalyst for citywide, and eventually nationwide, change. What started as a shocking display of abuse of power turned into an opportunity for a community to come together, demand accountability, and spark a broader conversation about respect, justice, and reform. As news of the event spread, so did public outrage. Protests filled the city streets, with residents from all walks of life marching to demand better oversight of law enforcement and stronger protections for first responders. Signs reading "Justice for Darren," "Protect our paramedics," and "End abuse of power" filled the air. Activists and community leaders used the incident as a rallying cry to address long-standing issues of prejudice and unchecked authority within the police force. At the same time, Darren found himself at the center of a growing movement. Despite his reluctance to take the spotlight, he knew the importance of speaking out. "This isn't just about me," he said during an interview. "It's about ensuring no one else, paramedic, firefighter, or anyone else, has to face what I did just for doing their job." While Darren became a symbol of integrity and professionalism, Radcliffe faced mounting consequences. The internal investigation into his behavior revealed a troubling pattern of complaints and misconduct that had been overlooked for years. As public pressure intensified, the police department had no choice but to take decisive action. Radcliffe was officially terminated from his position, and criminal charges were filed against him, including assault and obstruction of emergency services. His fall from grace was swift, and many saw it as a long overdue reckoning for a man who had abused his authority for far too long. But the story didn't end there. The city's leadership announced a comprehensive review of police practices, including mandatory de-escalation training, bias awareness programs, and stricter accountability measures for officers. Mayor Thompson himself, now fully recovered, vowed to oversee the reforms personally. "This incident was a wake-up call," he said. "We must do better. For our first responders, for our citizens, and for the future of this city." Darren's story resonated far beyond the city. Donations poured in from across the country to support the paramedics who had worked tirelessly to save Mayor Thompson's life. The funds were used to upgrade ambulance equipment, provide additional training, and establish a support network for emergency responders who face similar challenges. Local businesses and community organizations also stepped up. One group organized a Paramedic Appreciation Day to honor Darren and his team, drawing thousands of attendees. Darren, ever humble, accepted the recognition with grace. "I didn't do anything special," he said during a speech. "I just did my job. But if my story can help spark change, then I'm proud to have played a part." Mayor Thompson, a charismatic and beloved leader, used his platform to amplify the call for justice and equality. In a televised address, he spoke directly to the community. "We cannot allow prejudice, ignorance, or unchecked power to undermine the values we hold dear. This is about more than one incident. It's about the kind of city we want to be. Together, we can create a place where everyone, no matter their role, is treated with dignity and respect." His words struck a chord, not just with the city, but with people across the nation. Social media lit up with hashtags like #JusticeForDarren, #SupportParamedics, and #ReformNow. The incident had become a flashpoint for broader conversations about systemic reform and accountability. As the dust began to settle, Darren continued to do what he loved most, saving lives and helping others. But his impact went far beyond his work in the ambulance. He became a quiet yet powerful advocate for first responders, speaking at events and working with local organizations to ensure his colleagues had the resources and support they needed. When asked what he hoped people would take away from his story, Darren's answer was simple: respect. That's what this all comes down to. Respect for people, respect for the work we do, and respect for the lives we're trying to save. If we can learn to treat each other with that kind of respect, we'll all be better for it. As the dust began to settle, Darren continued to do what he loved most, saving lives and helping others. But his impact went far beyond his work in the ambulance. He became a quiet yet powerful advocate for first responders, speaking at events and working with local organizations to ensure his colleagues had the resources and support they needed. When asked what he hoped people would take away from his story, Darren's answer was simple: respect. That's what this all comes down to. Respect for people, respect for the work we do, and respect for the lives we're trying to save. If we can learn to treat each other with that kind of respect, we'll all be better for it. If this story has inspired you, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Stories like Darren's need to be heard, and your support helps us bring these important conversations to a wider audience. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you'll never miss an update. And if you know someone who could benefit from hearing this story, share it with them. Because change starts with awareness, and awareness starts with stories like these. Thank you for watching, and let's keep working together to create a better, fairer world.